This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart, live from the WNYC studios in Soho. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. I'm really grateful that you're here. On today's show, singer-songwriter Grace Potter is here to preview her forthcoming album and play live in Studio 5. And we'll hear from authors Tayari Jones, George Saunders, and T. Kira Madden about their latest novels. That is our plan. So let's get this started with translator and classicist Emily Wilson. The opening line of the Odyssey, Homer's epic poem about Odysseus, the king of Ithaca who simply wants to go home after war, has been told in many ways. In 1932, T.E. Lawrence translated it to "Divine Posy, goddess daughter of Zeus, sustain me, this song of the various-minded man." In 1996, Robert Fagles translated it to "Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns." The way classical studies professor Emily Wilson begins her 27 translation of the Odyssey, "Tell me about a complicated man." That opening line directly inspired Christopher Nolan's own adaptation of the Odyssey, which lands in theaters on Friday. Wilson's translation has been taught in college courses and praised by fellow scholars and authors. Madeline Miller is the author of the best-selling Circe and Song of Achilles, and she wrote, "It is rare to find a translation that is at once so effortlessly easy to read and so rigorously considered." University of Pennsylvania professor Emily Wilson will be in conversation with Sarah Rule at the 92nd Street Y this Thursday ahead of the film's release. She joins me now to discuss this epic poem, its legacy, and the challenges of translation. Emily, welcome to All of It.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, do you have questions about the process of translation? Have you read Wilson's translation? Are there passages from the Odyssey that stand out to you in whatever language you're reading it in? You can text to us now at 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. When you're approaching any translation of any work, what are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about so many different things at once because there is so much going on in any text, but especially with a ancient, complex, multi-layered poetic text. And of course, I'm thinking about meaning, I'm thinking about emotional effect, I'm thinking about tone and register. I'm thinking also about sound and rhythm. The Odyssey is an epic poem that emerged from a long oral tradition and was usually experienced in antiquity in performance. So we may be thinking in terms of the movie adaptation, that's a book that's being translated into a performance genre, cinema. But in some ways, that's quite authentic to the original insofar as performance by a single person was how most people experienced Homer. So I think a lot about meter, about the fact that this poem has a rhythm. I love the fact that we've been told by the previews that there's going to be a rapper in this version of the Odyssey. Love that, because there's so much about the Odyssey that's about music, that's about this rhythmicality to the language and the storytelling.
What are you less concerned about changing?
In terms of changing, I mean, translation is changing everything, right? There are none of the words in my translation that are the same as the original. I'm not writing in Homeric Greek. I'm tend to think that one has to make some choices, and there are going to be hard choices, that I'm constantly going to be having to think, if I want to convey this is a poem in a traditional meter, then I'm going to use the traditional meter that's traditional for English, which is iambic pentameter, rather than dactylic hexameter, which actually only one translator in the English tradition, Rodney Merrill, has used. So most translators in the modern period have used free verse or prose. I don't want to give up on meter at all, but I'm going to use a different meter.
In the original Odyssey, is there anything that we should consider or keep in mind about the Odyssey as this conversation starts about translating it?
I mean, there's so much to keep in mind, right? It's hard to know where to start. I think it's important to bear in mind that this poem is both extremely ancient and therefore in some ways difficult to access. It's unfamiliar in many of the things that people do in this poem. Most readers nowadays don't perform animal sacrifice on the regular, for instance. We don't worship Athena anymore, at least most of us don't. And yet there are also so many elements of this poem that are so accessible and familiar. It's a poem about families, about home, about being lost. about eating and the fear of different foodways. And all of those things are relatable as well as strange in the ways that they mutate in the world of this mythical poetic narrative.
It's sort of an odd question to ask, but who is Homer? Did he write it?
Yes, it's
Did
a
he?
difficult question to answer. Scholars still debate
Oh,
how did this oral tradition come to be a monumental written poem? We know that the Greek-speaking world had no literacy up till the middle of the 8th century BCE. And sometime soon after that, somebody or other, or maybe some somebodies, maybe it was a plural group of people, got together and used this new technology of writing to create the Odyssey and the Iliad. What do we know about Homer as an individual? Pretty much nothing. We know that the poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, come from the eastern part of the Greek-speaking world. We know that linguistically. So somebody or other, or perhaps several somebodies around the area of the islands of Chios, Lesbos, what's now Turkey, that area of the world. Ancient traditions said Homer was a blind man who came from rocky Chios. But who knows, really? We honestly don't know.
I'm speaking to classical studies professor Emily Wilson. She's the author of the 2017 translation of the Odyssey. It helped inspire Christopher Nolan's film adaptation. And we are taking your texts. What questions do you have about the process of translation? Have you read Wilson's translation? Are there passages of the Odyssey that stand out to you? If you have any questions, or what are you looking forward to, or you're feeling cautious about Christopher Nolan's film adaptation, you can text us now at 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. We got a text here that says, wow, very exciting guest. I read her translation of the Odyssey during the pandemic. I didn't know the story, but now think about it all the time. Rosy-fingered Dawn.
Mm-hmm. Love that. That's great. Yes. I love rosy-fingered dawn, which is one of the many very beautiful traditional epithets that come up repeatedly in the Odyssey and the Iliad, along with phrases like wine dark sea, which of course are part of the legacy of the oral tradition, but also part of how this poem builds this very detailed, visceral depiction of a material and social landscape.
What are the words and phrases that lend themselves to different translations? And how does a translator decide how to use those words?
It's difficult, right? I mean, that's part of why translation is so difficult. Maybe so. Can I read a tiny bit of just the beginning of the poem in, I could do Greek and then English, and then we could talk about that first epithet, maybe?
Let's do it.
What? Let's do that. Okay. Yes. So this is the beginning of the Odyssey. I'll do Greek first. Andra moi ennepe musa polutropon hos malapolla plankthe epei troiesi oron toliethron epersen. Pollon danthropon idenastia, kai non egno, politogem pontu pathenalgia, hon katathumon, arnumenos hentep suken, kai noston hetairon. I'll just stop there because I don't want to go on too long in Greek, but I will read the beginning in my translation, and then we can talk about any part that people want to text in to ask about. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. And I hope you can hear that one of the challenges that I'm trying to echo is that there's this rhythmicality to it, there's this alliteration, and then there's also just the question of particular words. So, for instance, in that first passage of the Odyssey, the word nostos and cognates of it, nostimon, herma, come up repeatedly. It means specifically a homecoming journey from war, but we don't have a single word that means that. Instead, we have this very laden in English word home. So I try to repeat home, homecoming, home, but that doesn't exactly have the same connotation of specifically coming home from a war. And that's going to be the case with any language pair, that we have these gaps between how does each language individuate the world.
Could you read that first passage again, your translation of it? Because there's something I picked up in it.
Yes. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home.
How he wrecked the town of Troy.
Yes.
He did a lot of wreckage. He left a lot of wreckage behind.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yes. So, yes, one of the epithets of Odysseus, along with being polythropos, being complicated or subject to turns, much disguised tourney, is that he's also Polyporthos. He's a city sacker. And that when we first meet him in the Odyssey, we understand this is someone who has already sacked a city. And now he's going to come home. And I don't want to spoil the poem, but there's going to be some
People
more,
know.
there's going to be some more warrior action. So that's one of the challenges, I think, also of approaching the Odyssey, is the multiplicity of Odysseus and the fact that he's both a clever hero, but he's also a violent warrior hero. He wins glory by both of those elements of his capacities.
What else is complicated about Odysseus?
He's constantly in disguise. He's a master of code switching. He's able to survive dangers that other Greek warriors don't survive because he's so clever, and also because he has Athena on his side, who's the cleverest of the Olympian deities, the daughter of Zeus, who's born straight from her father's head. So he's able to outwit people and perform impossible feats that have to do with strategy and patience and biding your time. He has the longest possible homecoming. And yet, even though his wife has been waiting for 20 long years, and even though she has so many suitors asking her to marry them, she's held out for as long as humanly possible. And eventually, Odysseus, even though he's in disguise as an old beggar, will eventually reveal himself as the warrior and come home.
This is an interesting question. It says, I'm reading Emily Wilson's translation this summer, and I want to know, what does she think of the controversy over casting of Nolan's movie? Also, I heard her translation puts women in the poem in a more positive light. So there's two parts to that
Great
question.
questions. Yes. I mean, I think it's difficult to comment on the film without having seen it, which I'm going to see. I'm going to see it in a couple of days. I'm excited. I think the controversy is mostly sort of made up a stand-in for racism and mostly for racism, I would say. I mean, I think there's an idea that the ancient literature has to belong to modern white people, which I think is completely historically foolish, and also, of course, ethically and politically foolish. The Greeks were not white and didn't imagine themselves as white. That's actually a modern category. Helen of Troy has to be played by somebody who can convincingly be very smart and perceptive, as well as very attractive. I don't see that there's anything wrong with casting insofar as that seems like something this actor can certainly do.
Yeah, Lupita Nyong'o is playing Helen of Troy, and
yes, exactly. And then we have Zendaya being Athena. Exactly. The fact that Matt Damon comes from Boston rather than from Ithaca, New York, maybe we should have got somebody from Ithaca. I don't know, but I think it's going to be okay.
This says, what is Emily's favorite translation next to her own?
That's a lovely question. I tend to like the older ones, the pre-20th century ones. I have a real fondness for the Chapman translation of the Odyssey, which is the first complete translation into English from the early 17th century. I love how Chapman he was a verse dramatist as well as a translator, and the themes that he thought about his whole career as a warrior, a courtier, and a playwright were to do with revenge, which actually resonates really well with the themes of the Odyssey. I also love the Alexander Pope translations, though I think his Iliad, which he didn't have collaborators on, is better than his Odyssey.
I'm speaking to classical studies professor Emily Wilson. She's the author of a 2017 translation of the Odyssey. It helped inspire Christopher Nolan's film adaptation. We are taking your tests. What questions do you have about the process of translation? Have you read Wilson's translation? Are there any passages of the Odyssey that stand out to you? Our number is 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. We'll be right back after a quick break. You're listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. My guest is classical studies professor Emily Wilson. She's the author of a 2017 translation of the Odyssey. It helped inspire Christopher Nolan's film adaptation. Our audience knows a lot about this translation. You are the first woman to publish an English translation of the Odyssey. This happened in 2017. 2017. And somebody wrote this text in that says, as a major in painting and also philosophy of aesthetics, and having lived in the Greek islands, I've been obsessed with the Odyssey, and like many, like Joyce, imagined my life journey in the parable. And like many women, had my own thoughts. I'm wondering what Emily's personal goal was in doing a translation. Was it her personal translation Everest? And did she have a POV because at last, being a woman doing a translation?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I realized I didn't. Somebody else asked that before, and I didn't get to it then. So I'm glad it's come back, because the audience obviously cares about this question. I personally was primarily motivated in doing this translation by poetic and translatorly and literary goals. I thought that the translations that I'd used with my students over the past 20 years or so of teaching the Odyssey, both in translations and in the original, had certain things that were missing in them that I felt I could do something different that will respond to the original in new ways, including using traditional meter, but not using entirely fake Edwardian kinds of lexicon, echoing the clarity of the storytelling and syntax of the original, but then also along with that clarity and rapidity of narrative, echoing the fact that there were multiple different points of view. Multiple different points of view in the poem includes the fact that female characters in Homer are not treated as inherently less interesting than male characters are. But it wasn't that I thought, okay, let me do a feminist retelling. I love the fact that Madeline Miller did that with Circe. That's not what I'm doing with the translation. I hope there's fodder for new readers and painters and creative artists to do more with it, with my version and with other versions out there. But this is not a retelling, this is a translation. I want not to assume ahead of time this is a female character, so she's going to be presented as inherently ridiculous or lesser, or we don't care about her perspective. Because I actually don't think that's the case in terms of how does the Homeric narrative treat female characters. So, for instance, in looking at other translations of, for instance, the wonderful exchange between the goddess Calypso and Odysseus, when Calypso reluctantly lets Odysseus go on his way after having kept him captive on her island of secrecy and hiding for 7 years. I think we get in that scene Calypso's perspective as well as Odysseus's perspective. And similarly, when the exchanges with Helen or with Penelope, I think we're invited to take them seriously. So some translations add in abusive language that I think isn't in the original. So it's not that I'm trying to rewrite the poem. I'm trying to be honest about and truthful about the fact that the original allows us to feel respect for female characters, including divine female characters.
This question says, can you ask Emily if the ancient Greeks had a word for the color blue? It's a point of contention for some translators.
That's also a very classic question. Ancient Greek, especially archaic Homeric Greek, has a much more limited color palette than most modern languages, including English, do. And very often there are words that correspond to more colors than our color words do in most post-industrial languages. So, for instance, there's a word kuaneos, which is used for blue enamel, but it's also used for the color of eyebrows and the color of oxen. And we don't usually think, oh, yes, there's a blue ox. We don't usually think that an ox is the same color as enamel. And yet in Homeric Greek, they're treated as they can be described in the same way, which arguably is because some of these words which we may think of as words for hue are really words for is it densely dark or is it bright and glittery? And that maybe it's actually primarily referring to these things are dark in color. An ox is dark in color, a scowly face eyebrow is dark in color, so is a storm cloud. All of these things can have the same word, which might overlap with contexts where we would say that's blue. But in Homeric Greek, it's dark, but that might be a bluish kind of dark, but it's dark primarily.
This one says, I recently read the Fagle's Odyssey and his Iliad also. I'm also eagerly looking forward to reading Ms. Wilson's translation. I am thankful to all the scholars that patiently do this work and allow us modern readers to experience these works. I just wanted to say that as well.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
this says, this is funny. It's not funny, but I never liked Odysseus. He cheats on his wife, who you mentioned worked hard to wait for him and puts his men at risk. They literally all died. Why
Mhm.
is he seen as a hero?
He's seen as a heros in the ancient archaic tradition. That is not the same as a modern quote unquote hero.
Oh,
The
interesting.
connotations of the modern English word hero suggest this is the kind of good guy who's going to save people. He's going to swoop in, like Superman, and he's going to make the world a better place, make things safer for everyone. That's not the connotation of a heros in the archaic context. The connotation of a quote unquote hero in a archaic context is it's someone who is very close to the gods and does extraordinary things. And that might, and also is fixated on and manages to win eternal glory, which is why we're still singing songs about Odysseus all these many centuries later, because he's extraordinary and he's close with Athena. So I don't think this person is actually out of tune with ancient perceptions of Odysseus. In later periods of classical antiquity, Odysseus was seen as a pretty dodgy character. He was associated by Sophocles with the sophists of the late 5th century, the kind of sweet talking guys who got us into the Peloponnesian War. He's a sophist in that sense.
Hmm.
Within the context of the Odyssey, he's heroic because he wins great glory against all possible odds, but that's not about being nice. And I think the poem is actually really interested in exploring what are the costs of heroic glory as well as what are the gains. That he wins great glory for himself, but certainly not for all those guys who do not get to come home, and certainly
Hmm.
not for the people who get slaughtered once he does reveal himself. So there's also this real running thread in the poem about the conflict between a world in which we just want a few glorious individuals to get whatever they want for themselves, or would we rather have a more egalitarian society? And this poem was produced at this historical moment where some Greek communities were more egalitarian than others.
You've said in the past that you're not the biggest fan of some adaptations, some film adaptations. When was the last time you saw a film adaptation and you thought it was done correctly, it was done right?
I think I don't remember what I've said in the past. I'm sure I've said all kinds of silly things. I think it's fascinating that there were so many adaptations. I mean, including in this long tradition of theatrical and narrative adaptations and lyric adaptations, as well as film adaptations. I really enjoyed The Return, which was starred Ralph Fiennes
Mhm.
and Juliette Binoche. I'm also really looking forward to what I expect will be a very sharp contrast between the way The Return interprets the narrative of the Odyssey for cinema, which is this very, very stripped down narrative, doesn't have any gods or goddesses, which of course I was a bit sad not to have gods and goddesses. I love the goddesses. But in any case, I loved also just getting to watch those two amazing actors playing this very minimalist version of what might the poem's narrative be if it's just about why does Odysseus come back and why does he kill so many people when he does so?
What other translations would you recommend to people who have read your translation already?
I mean, I've already talked about the old ones that I like. I like
Okay.
the Chapman. I like the Alexander Pope. I think just dipping into multiple different translations is always absolutely fascinating. And I think it's a real privilege that we live in a time when there are so many different translations. And just trying a few pages of translations in different styles can also be illuminating about how translation practices changed over different generations, as well as different attitudes towards the poem itself.
I'm curious, is did people have a problem with Homer? Because we're going to get adaptations and we're going to get reviews of this film. What were the reviews of Homer? Did people have an issue with him?
I mean, reviews didn't really exist in
You know what I
in
mean?
quite the same way. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think there's always been a tradition of debate about both the Homeric poems themselves and the myths that that they're engaged with. I already talked about Athenian tragedy, which is constantly reinventing those same myths and always trying to do it differently. Euripides reinvents the story of Helen of Troy, making her not Helen of Troy. She just stayed in Egypt the whole time, and she was a good girl, never slept with anyone except her husband. It's a radical pushback against the Homeric tradition. We have parts of several poems by Sappho from the 6th century, who was a female lyric poet from the island of Lesbos, in which she seems in some ways to push back against the narrative of the Iliad, where this wonderful poem starts. Some say the most beautiful thing on the black earth is an army. Some say it's a navy. So some people say you should write the Iliad, but I say it's whatever you want, and it's whoever you desire. And let me tell you about my girlfriend. So in a way, that's a radical pushback against the militaristic tradition of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
University of Pennsylvania professor Emily Wilson will be in conversation with Sarah Ruhl at the 92nd Street Y this Thursday ahead of the film's release, The Odyssey. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it.
Sure, it's really fun. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.